The wind howls across a barren expanse of grass in South Lanarkshire, Scotland. It is February 1927. A team of demolition workers, their breath visible in the frozen air, positions explosives beneath marble columns that once welcomed kings. In 3 days, they will detonate charges that will bring down walls standing for 3 centuries. Inside, auction tags flutter from gilded mirrors. Numbered lots mark treasures that Napoleon himself would have envied. The greatest private palace ever built in Britain, a structure containing 18 state apartments, a chapel modeled on the Vatican, and a mausoleum larger than most cathedrals, is being sold piece by piece, stone by stone, memory by memory. This is Hamilton Palace. And this is the story of how 17 generations of one of Scotland's most powerful families built a monument to rival Versailles, only to watch it sink, quite literally, into the ground beneath their feet. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. Over 250 rooms spread across a frontage of 265 feet, a north front designed to exceed Buckingham Palace, art collections valued at over $400,000 in 1882, approximately $50 million in today's currency, annual operating costs that would bankrupt a small nation, and beneath it all, coal seams that would both create the wealth to build this palace and ultimately cause its destruction. How does the greatest house in Britain become a car park? How does a family with more titles than any other in Scotland, Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, Baron, all held simultaneously, end up homeless? And what happens to the thousands of workers, servants, and local residents whose entire existence revolved around this vanished world? The answers lie buried not just in the coalfields of Lanarkshire, but in centuries of ambition, extravagance, and a peculiar family curse that seemed to guarantee each generation would die young, leaving debts that would cascade through time like falling dominoes. This is not simply the story of a demolished building. This is the story of hubris carved in stone, of workers who died in darkness to fuel aristocratic dreams, of art treasures scattered across 3 continents, and of a hole in the Scottish landscape that refuses to be forgotten. Chapter 1. The Last Dawn. On the morning of September 15, 1919, the 13th Duke of Hamilton stood in the great gallery of his ancestral home and made a decision that had been 3 centuries in the making. Alfred Douglas Hamilton, a man who held more noble titles than any other peer in Britain, was about to admit defeat. The great gallery stretched 120 feet before him, its walls lined with old masters that his ancestors had collected with obsessive determination. Rubens hung beside Titian. Van Dyck's portraits of Stuart kings gazed down with painted disapproval. The ceiling, decorated by artists imported from Rome at ruinous expense, depicted the Hamilton family's supposed descent from the Byzantine emperors. But the Duke was not looking at the art. He was looking at the cracks. They spider-webbed across the plasterwork, visible evidence of a problem that had been growing for 50 years. Hamilton Palace was sinking. The coal mines that had made the family wealthy beyond imagination were now, ironically, destroying the palace built upon their profits. Each ton of coal extracted from beneath the estate removed another support from beneath the foundation. Each year, the subsidence grew worse. The Duke's agents had calculated the cost of stabilization at over $1 million, an impossible sum for a family already drowning in death duties and maintenance costs. The annual expense of simply running the palace exceeded $60,000. Servants alone numbered over 140. The heating bill for a single winter could purchase a comfortable London townhouse. "It cannot continue," the Duke reportedly told his solicitor that morning. "We must consider alternatives." Alternatives, such a polite word for what would become the most spectacular demolition in British architectural history. Hamilton Palace had survived civil wars, religious upheavals, and 2 centuries of Scottish weather. It had hosted Mary Queen of Scots, Oliver Cromwell, and Queen Victoria. Its chapel held the mortal remains of 12 generations of Hamiltons, including the first Duke, whose preserved body would need to be relocated before the wrecking balls could swing. But it could not survive the 20th century. The decision to demolish was not made immediately. For nearly a decade, the family explored options. Selling to the National Trust proved impossible. The trust could not afford the maintenance costs. Converting to a hotel failed when engineers confirmed the subsidence was accelerating. One proposal suggested turning the grounds into a cemetery, with the palace serving as a colossal mausoleum. The Duke declined. By 1921, the family had accepted the inevitable. But first, they would strip the palace of everything movable, and there was much to move. The Hamilton Collection, as it became known, represented perhaps the finest private art assemblage in Britain outside the royal collection. The 10th Duke alone had spent over $600,000 on acquisitions during the early 19th century, a sum equivalent to roughly $75 million today. He had purchased entire galleries from Italian palaces. He had commissioned furniture from the greatest craftsmen in France. He had built a private museum wing solely to house Egyptian antiquities that rivaled those in the British Museum. All of this would now go under the hammer. Christie's conducted the sale over 17 days in 1882, following the death of the 12th Duke. It was then the largest house sale ever held in Britain. The catalogue ran to 2,213 lots. Buyers came from America, Russia, and across Europe. William Randolph Hearst purchased armorials. American industrialists bought paintings that now hang in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But the family retained the palace itself, believing that somehow the next generation would solve the unsolvable problem. They did not. The final sale commenced in October 1919 and continued periodically until 1927. Architectural salvage companies purchased the building piece by piece. The grand staircase went to a hotel in Glasgow. Marble fireplaces were shipped to America. Doors, paneling, and plasterwork were catalogued, numbered, and scattered across the globe. The mausoleum, too massive to demolish economically, was left standing. Today it remains the only visible evidence of what once stood here, a bronze-doored monument to a vanished world, surrounded by the municipal grass of a public park. But to understand why Hamilton Palace rose so high only to fall so completely, we must travel back to a different century entirely. Back to a time when the Hamiltons were not yet dukes, but were already among the most dangerous families in Scotland. Their story begins not with architecture, but with murder. Chapter 2. Blood and Ambition. The Hamilton family's rise to power began, as such rises often do, with violence. In the year 1320, Walter Fitzgilbert of Hamilton, the anglicised Norman form of what would become Hamilton, appears in Scottish records as a knight loyal to Robert the Bruce. The family had arrived from England only decades earlier, probably as minor Norman nobility seeking opportunity in the frontier politics of medieval Scotland. They found that opportunity in blood. The original Hamilton lands in South Lanarkshire came through strategic marriage and, when necessary, strategic elimination of rivals. By 1445, the family had accumulated enough power for James Hamilton to be created the first Lord Hamilton. His grandson would marry into the royal Stuart line, setting the family on a course that would bring them within touching distance of the Scottish throne itself. This proximity to royalty proved both blessing and curse. James Hamilton, 2nd Earl of Arran, served as Regent of Scotland during the minority of Mary Queen of Scots. For 11 years, he was the most powerful man in the kingdom. He also came close to having his charge marry his own son, which would have placed the Hamiltons on the throne directly. Only the intervention of French diplomacy prevented this dynastic coup, but the family never forgot how close they had come. This frustrated royal ambition would drive Hamilton behavior for centuries. It explains the palace they built, a structure designed to rival any royal residence in Europe. It explains the art they collected, the trappings of sovereignty even without the crown. And it explains the financial recklessness that would ultimately destroy them, spending like kings while maintaining only a duke's income. The first significant Hamilton residence at the palace's eventual site was built in the early 16th century. Records describe a tower house typical of Scottish nobility, defensible, uncomfortable, and profoundly unimpressive by continental standards. For Day, a family that saw itself as quasi-royal, this would not do. The first Marquess of Hamilton began significant expansion in the early 17th century. He added formal gardens and a longer frontage, but the real transformation would wait for his descendants. The critical moment came in 1643, when James Hamilton was created first Duke of Hamilton by Charles I. This elevation came at enormous personal cost. The Duke was a moderate attempting to mediate between a stubborn king and an inflexible Scottish Parliament. His reward for this impossible diplomatic position was execution by Parliament in 1649, just 1 month after Charles I lost his own head. But the dukedom survived, passing through a complex inheritance to the third Duke, who initiated the first truly grand building campaign. The third Duke commissioned William Adam, Scotland's foremost architect and father of the more famous Robert Adam, to rebuild the north front of the palace. Adam's design, completed in 1732, created a Palladian facade of enormous scale. 2 massive towers framed a central block featuring a giant portico supported by Corinthian columns. The cost was staggering for its time, approximately $15,000, equivalent to roughly $2.5 million today. But this was only the beginning. What drove this extravagance? Contemporary sources suggest a complex mixture of personal ambition and political anxiety. The Hamiltons, despite their antiquity, felt perpetually insecure. Their claim to the Scottish throne through the Stuart line made them objects of suspicion to the Hanoverian monarchy. Their Catholicism, maintained longer than most Scottish noble families, isolated them socially. Their Scottish identity set them apart in an increasingly London-centered aristocratic world. Architecture became their answer. If they could not rule, they would at least outbuild those who did. The third Duke's work established the template that future generations would follow. Always expand, always improve, never economize. Each succeeding Duke seemed driven to outdo his predecessor, regardless of financial reality. This pattern would reach its apex and its absurdity with Alexander, the 10th Duke. A man so obsessed with magnificence that he commissioned his own sarcophagus from the same quarry that had provided stone for the pharaohs. A man who spent more on a single Egyptian artifact than his coal miners earned in a lifetime. A man who built a palace wing simply to house a collection of paintings that he rarely visited. But before we can understand the 10th Duke's mania, we must first examine the physical transformation that made Hamilton Palace possible. We must descend into the earth itself, into the coal seams that would simultaneously create the Hamilton fortune and guarantee its destruction. The story of Hamilton Palace is ultimately a story of what lies beneath. Chapter 3. Black gold and white marble. Beneath the rolling grasslands of the Hamilton estate lay the foundation of everything. Coal. The thick seams that ran under South Lanarkshire had been known since medieval times, but large-scale extraction began only in the 17th century. By the 18th century, Hamilton coal was fueling the furnaces of Glasgow's expanding industries, and the profits were flowing directly into the family coffers. The coal mines operated under the feudal rights system that persisted in Scotland long after its abolition in England. Until 1799, Scottish miners were effectively serfs, legally bound to their pit for life, their children automatically inheriting their servitude. The Hamiltons, like other Scottish landowners, owned not just the coal, but the men who extracted it. This system produced enormous wealth with minimal capital investment. The workers came with the land. They could not leave. They had no bargaining power. Their wages, such as they were, returned immediately to the estate through company housing and company stores. Contemporary accounts of Hamilton's mining operations paint a grim picture. Women and children worked underground, hauling coal in baskets on their backs through tunnels too narrow for carts. A parliamentary report from 1842 described conditions that shocked even Victorian sensibilities. Children as young as 6 years old, working 12-hour shifts in complete darkness, women giving birth in mine tunnels, families living in single-room cottages provided by the estate. While these workers earned perhaps $20 to $30 annually, the Hamilton family was spending that sum on a single dinner party. The 10th Duke, Alexander Hamilton, inherited the dukedom in 1819. He would spend the next 33 years transforming Hamilton Palace into the most spectacular private residence in Britain. The contrast between his world and that of the miners who funded it could hardly be more stark. Alexander Douglas Hamilton, he had adopted the Douglas name through inheritance, was born into privilege, but cultivated extravagance. His grand tour of Europe lasted over a decade. He developed particular passions for Egyptian antiquities and Napoleonic memorabilia. He married a princess of the House of Baden, and he brought all of these continental influences to bear on his reconstruction of Hamilton Palace. The Duke's architect for the major rebuilding was David Hamilton, no relation, one of Glasgow's most prominent practitioners. Between 1822 and 1832, they transformed the north front into a neoclassical composition that one contemporary observer described as worthy of Rome itself. The numbers reveal the scale of ambition. The new facade stretched 265 feet. The central portico featured columns 36 feet tall, carved from local stone but polished to resemble marble. The entrance hall rose through 2 stories to a painted ceiling depicting the apotheosis of the Hamilton family. But the Duke's ambitions extended far beyond mere architecture. He commissioned furniture from leading Parisian craftsmen at costs that would have purchased entire estates. A single cabinet by the renowned ébéniste André-Charles Boulle cost more than a miner might earn in 50 years of labor. The Duke owned 18 pieces by Boulle alone. His art collecting bordered on mania. When the Orléans collection, one of the great aristocratic assemblages of Europe, was broken up following the French Revolution, the Duke purchased extensively. Paintings by Rubens, Titian, and Veronese joined earlier Hamilton acquisitions to create a gallery rivaling any national museum. And then there was Egypt. The Duke's fascination with Egyptian antiquities led him to spend over $10,000 on artifacts, including sarcophagi, canopic jars, and architectural fragments. But his greatest Egyptian ambition was personal. He commissioned his own sarcophagus from stone quarried at the same Egyptian site that had provided material for the pharaohs. This sarcophagus, carved from porphyry and polished to a mirror finish, cost approximately $11,000. It would eventually hold the Duke's embalmed body in the private mausoleum he built adjacent to the palace. The mausoleum itself represented the Duke's ultimate statement. Designed by David Bryce and completed in 1858, the structure rose to 120 feet with a dome modeled on the Mausoleum of Hadrian in Rome. Bronze doors weighing over a ton each closed the entrance. Inside, the acoustics were so remarkable that a whispered word at one end could be heard clearly at the other, a 15-second reverberation that made the space useless for conventional religious services, but perfect for theatrical effect. Construction of the mausoleum required over 15,000 tons of stone. Specialist craftsmen were imported from Italy. The total cost exceeded $130,000, enough to have housed every mining family on the estate in comfortable cottages. But the Duke did not think in such terms. His accounts show no awareness of contradiction between his expenditure on immortality and the conditions of those who made that expenditure possible. While marble was being polished in the mausoleum, children were dying in the mines that paid for it. Records indicate that mortality rates in Hamilton collieries exceeded the already grim Scottish average. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and chronic lung disease claimed workers in numbers that were never precisely recorded. They were not, after all, considered important enough to count. The 10th Duke died in 1852, before seeing his mausoleum completed. His body was embalmed, a procedure costing $1,500, and placed temporarily in the palace chapel. When the mausoleum was ready, he was transferred with appropriate ceremony to the Egyptian sarcophagus he had commissioned for himself. But even in death, he would find no peace. Subsidence would eventually threaten even the mausoleum. His body would be moved again, relocated to a local cemetery, the sarcophagus too heavy to follow. The 10th Duke left debts exceeding $800,000. He also left a palace so magnificent that none of his successors could afford to maintain it. The family's destruction was now only a matter of time, and the coal that had created the Hamilton fortune was about to take its revenge. Chapter 4. A Gilded Cage. The decades following the 10th Duke's death in 1852 represented Hamilton Palace at its zenith and its most fragile. The 11th Duke inherited not only the title, but also crushing debts that would take a generation to address. Yet the palace itself had never been more magnificent. Contemporary visitors described an experience that bordered on overwhelming. The entrance sequence alone required passage through 3 successive halls, each grander than the last. The final approach to the state apartments led through the Great Gallery, its 120-foot length lined with paintings and sculpture in calculated profusion. A German visitor in 1860 compared the effect to entering St. Peter's after expecting a country church. An American industrialist, touring British estates in search of ideas for his own mansion, declared Hamilton Palace the equal of any palace in Europe, royal or otherwise. The state apartments themselves occupied the entire piano nobile of the north front. Each room had been designed for specific ceremonial purposes, and each contained treasures worth small fortunes individually. The drawing room featured walls hung with crimson silk damask, replaced at enormous expense every 20 years to maintain its vivid color. The dining room seated 60 guests at a single table, attended by a choreographed ballet of footmen in Hamilton livery. But maintaining this magnificence required an army. Household accounts from the 1870s reveal a permanent indoor staff of 142 persons. This number swelled to over 200 during major entertaining seasons. The hierarchy was rigidly structured, with wages and privileges carefully graduated by position. At the top stood the house steward, earning approximately $200 annually with full board and significant perquisites. Below him, the butler oversaw all male servants. The housekeeper, always addressed as Mrs., regardless of marital status, commanded the female staff with corresponding authority. First footmen earned perhaps $40 per year. Housemaids received $15 to $20. Scullery maids, the lowest ranked of permanent staff, might receive $10 annually for labor that began before dawn and ended after midnight. These wages, while modest, represented economic security in a region where industrial employment offered brutal conditions and uncertain tenure. A position at Hamilton Palace conveyed social status beyond mere income. Servants who proved reliable might work their entire careers within the household, advancing through the ranks to positions of genuine responsibility. But the work was relentless. A housemaid's daily routine began at 5:30 a.m., with the cleaning of grates and laying of fires. The palace required over 50 individual fires to heat even minimally during winter. Breakfast preparation for the tomber, family and senior staff began by 6:09 a.m. The endless cycle of sweeping, polishing, and dusting continued until well after the family retired, often past midnight during entertaining seasons. The below-stairs world at Hamilton Palace was effectively a separate community. The servants' hall served meals to over 100 people at regular intervals. The staff quarters, located in wings carefully hidden from family view, contained their own chapel, recreation room, and extensive storage facilities. The kitchen operation alone required a staff of 23. The main kitchen measured over 2,000 square feet, equipped with ranges capable of roasting multiple animals simultaneously. Separate rooms handled pastry, confectionery, and the preparation of specialized dishes. A kitchen garden of 6 acres provided vegetables and fruits. The dairy processed milk from the estate's own herds. Annual food costs for the household exceeded $8,000, more than the combined annual wages of every servant on staff. Heating represented another staggering expense. The palace's coal consumption during winter months exceeded 200 tons. This coal came from the estate's own mines, but still required extraction, transport, and distribution throughout the vast building. A team of men worked full-time, simply maintaining the boilers that provided what limited central heating the palace possessed. Water supply, sewage, and electrical generation, after 1890, each required dedicated infrastructure and specialized workers. The palace operated its own gas works, its own laundry facility, and its own repair workshops. It was less a private home than a small municipality, entirely dependent on a single family's continued wealth and interest. And both were failing. The 11th Duke had worked diligently to reduce the debts inherited from his father. By careful estate management and reduced entertaining, he brought the family finances to something approaching stability. But his death in 1863, aged only 44, introduced a new problem: death duties. British inheritance tax, introduced in 1894, would eventually take substantial portions of great estates. But even before that formal legislation, the costs of death proved devastating. Probate fees, legal expenses, and the disruption of income during transitions repeatedly drained Hamilton resources. The 12th Duke, who succeeded in 1863, abandoned the palace almost immediately. He found its scale oppressive and its costs unbearable. For nearly 2 decades, Hamilton Palace stood largely empty, maintained at minimum expense by a skeleton staff, its treasures gathering dust, its purpose unclear. When the 12th Duke died in 1895, the Great Sale began. 17 days of auction dispersed art, furniture, and decorative objects accumulated over 3 centuries. The catalogue listed Rubens, Titian, and Van Dyck. It listed furniture by Boule and Riesener. It listed porcelain, silver, and Egyptian antiquities. The sale raised approximately $400,000, a massive sum, but insufficient to clear the accumulated debts or address the building's growing structural problems. For beneath all this magnificence, the coal mines were still operating, and with each ton extracted, the palace sank a little further into the earth. The subsidence that would ultimately doom Hamilton Palace had been noticed as early as the 1860s, but for decades, the family chose to ignore what they could not afford to confront. Chapter 5. Those who built and those who served behind every polished surface at Hamilton Palace stood laborers whose stories were rarely recorded. The construction of the palace's various iterations employed thousands of workers over 3 centuries. The mines that funded construction employed thousands more, and the daily operation of the completed estate required yet another invisible army. Their stories survive only in fragments, pieced together from estate records, parish registers, and the occasional memoir. The construction workers who rebuilt the North Front under the 10th Duke labored under conditions that would later prompt reform legislation. Stonemasons worked exposed to all weathers, shaping blocks that sometimes weighed several tons. No safety equipment existed. Falls from scaffolding were common and frequently fatal. Estate accounts record payments to widows of workers killed during construction, but these payments were discretionary rather than obligatory, and they were modest. A stonemason in the 1820s might earn 12 shillings per week during active construction. This represented reasonable wages for skilled labor, but the work was seasonal and unpredictable. Winter months brought layoffs. Economic downturns meant sudden dismissal. No pension or insurance protected workers or their families. The specialist craftsmen imported from Italy and France fared somewhat better. These artisans, stucco workers, gilders, specialist painters, negotiated individual contracts that often included housing and travel expenses, but they too labored at the Duke's pleasure, subject to dismissal if their work failed to satisfy. One surviving letter from an Italian plasterer named Giovanni Bertini describes working conditions in 1834. Bertini had been brought from Rome to execute ceiling decorations in the state apartments. He writes of working by candlelight through Scottish winter evenings, his materials barely workable in the cold. He requests additional payment for clothing suitable to the climate, a request that the Duke's agent initially refused before eventually relenting. Bertini's letter survives only because it was filed with financial records. Most workers left no documentary trace at all. The coal miners who funded all this construction lived in conditions that shocked contemporary observers. The village of Hamilton's coal mining communities consisted largely of estate-owned housing, single-room cottages with earthen floors, shared outhouses, and water from common pumps. Families of 6 or 8 persons occupied spaces smaller than the Duke's dressing room. Mining itself was extraordinarily dangerous. Before ventilation improvements in the mid-19th century, explosive gases accumulated in deep seams with regularity. The Hamilton collieries experienced multiple disasters, though precise records are incomplete. A single explosion in 1847 killed 17 men and boys, nearly 1/10 of the workforce at that particular pit. Working conditions underground defied modern imagination. Seams often measured less than 3 feet in height, requiring workers to labor on hands and knees. Women and children carried coal in baskets on their backs, climbing ladders that sometimes extended hundreds of feet to the surface. A child beginning work at age 6 might be physically broken by 30. Yet alternatives were limited. The estate's economic dominance of the region meant that mining families had few options. The tied housing system ensured that losing employment meant losing shelter. And the company store, where miners purchased necessities against future wages, created debt cycles that bound workers as effectively as any legal compulsion. The miners' relationship to the palace they funded was complex. Most never entered the grand rooms that their labor made possible. Seasonal hiring for garden work or beating during shooting parties provided rare glimpses of aristocratic life. But the contrast between worlds was apparent to anyone who cared to look. A miner's widow in the 1860s might receive a one-time payment of £5 from the estate, perhaps a month's wages for her deceased husband. That same year, the Duke spent £300 on a single painting. The domestic servants who staffed the palace occupied an intermediate position. They lived within the grand house itself, sharing in some small measure its comfort and splendor. But they remained firmly excluded from the world they served. Servants' memoirs from comparable estates describe a society of extraordinary rigidity. Speaking to family members without being addressed first was forbidden. Using the family's staircases risked immediate dismissal. Male and female servants were strictly segregated, with even the times of using shared spaces carefully regulated. Hamilton Palace's servant hierarchy replicated in miniature the class system that surrounded it. Upper servants, the butler, housekeeper, and lady's maid, dined separately from lower servants, ate better food, and enjoyed private sleeping quarters. They addressed lower servants by surname only and expected deference approaching that shown to the family itself. A housemaid might work 20 years without ever speaking directly to the Duke or Duchess. Her presence was meant to be invisible, like a piece of furniture that moved and cleaned and then retreated to quarters the family never visited. Yet some servants found opportunity within these constraints. The Hamilton Palace archives preserve the story of Margaret Crawford, who entered service as a scullery maid in 1838 at age 14. Over 45 years, she rose through the ranks to become housekeeper, a position carrying genuine authority and a comfortable retirement. Crawford's surviving letters reveal both pride in her position and awareness of its limitations. She describes the palace in proprietary terms: my still room, my china closets, while simultaneously acknowledging her permanent subordination. When she retired in 1883, she received a pension of £30 annually and a cottage on the estate. This represented a successful service career. Many others ended in disgrace, disability, or simple exhaustion. The estate that supported all these workers, miners, construction laborers, domestic servants, depended on continued Hamilton wealth. When that wealth began failing, the human cost proved devastating. The Great Sale of 1882 reduced the servant staff by half. The decision to close the palace entirely in 1919 eliminated remaining positions overnight. Former servants, many of whom had worked at Hamilton Palace for decades, found themselves without employment in a region already suffering from industrial decline. Their stories disappeared with them, but the palace whose grandeur their labor created would not outlive them long. Chapter 6. The ground gives way. The first cracks appeared in the 1860s, hairline fractures in plasterwork, doors that no longer closed properly, windows that stuck in their frames. The symptoms were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as the natural settling of an ancient building. But Hamilton Palace was not settling. It was sinking. The geology beneath the estate told a story written in coal seams and sandstone. For centuries, miners had extracted millions of tons of material from beneath the Hamilton lands. Each excavated tunnel, each emptied seam, removed support from the geological structure above. The weight of the palace, thousands of tons of stone, marble, and accumulated treasure, pressed downward onto foundations that were slowly losing their underpinning. Engineers call this phenomenon mining subsidence. It occurs gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly it does not. A building that has sunk an inch per decade may suddenly drop 6 inches in a single year. Cracks that seemed cosmetic become structural. Walls that leaned slightly begin to separate from floors. The mathematics of load-bearing fail catastrophically. By the 1880s, the subsidence at Hamilton Palace had become impossible to ignore. Surveyors measured differential settlement exceeding 18 inches across the building's footprint. The north front, the grandest section, rebuilt at such expense by the 10th Duke, was sinking faster than the older southern portions. The resulting stress was literally tearing the building apart. The 12th Duke, who had already largely abandoned the palace, commissioned engineering assessments that made for grim reading. Stabilization would require underpinning the entire foundation, a process involving excavation beneath existing walls and injection of concrete to create new load-bearing surfaces. The estimated cost exceeded $500,000, a figure that represented more than the Duke's total liquid assets. Moreover, the engineers could not guarantee success. The mines were still operating. New subsidence could undermine any stabilization work. The palace might be saved temporarily only to resume its descent within years. The Duke chose a different path. Rather than attempt the impossible, he stripped the palace of its movable contents and sold them. The Great Christie's sale of 1882 dispersed treasures accumulated over centuries, but it also generated desperately needed capital. What it could not do was stop the sinking. The 12th Duke died in 1895, leaving the palace and its problems to his cousin, who became the 13th Duke. Alfred Douglas Hamilton inherited a structure that was now visibly distressed. Ceiling ornaments had separated from their supports. Marble flooring had cracked along stress lines. The grand staircase showed measurable deviation from true. The 13th Duke maintained a reduced presence at the palace while exploring options. Sale to the nation was proposed and rejected. The government had no interest in acquiring a building that might collapse. Conversion to institutional use failed for similar reasons. No insurance company would cover a structure with such obvious instability. Meanwhile, the subsidence continued. By 1919, measurements showed the north front had sunk over 3 feet from its original position. The differential with the south range exceeded 2 feet. Door frames had deformed so severely that some doors could no longer be opened. Load-bearing walls showed cracks wide enough to insert a hand. The palace had become genuinely dangerous. The 13th Duke made his final decision that autumn. Hamilton Palace would be demolished. The contents would be sold, the materials salvaged, and the site cleared. 3 centuries of Hamilton ambition would be reduced to rubble. The announcement shocked Scotland. Hamilton Palace was not merely a private residence. It was a national monument, a symbol of Scottish aristocratic achievement, a treasure house without parallel in the country. Petitions circulated demanding government intervention. Newspapers published editorials lamenting the loss. Architects proposed increasingly desperate schemes for salvation. None succeeded. The fundamental problem remained. The palace was worthless as a structure because the ground beneath it would not stop moving. No amount of sentiment could change that geological reality. The sale of remaining contents began in October 1919 and continued sporadically for years. Architectural salvage companies purchased the building itself, paying for the right to dismantle and sell its components. The grand staircase went to a Glasgow hotel. Marble chimney pieces were shipped to America. Stone balustrades found their way to gardens across Britain. The demolition process began in earnest in 1921. Workers who might have built houses instead took them apart, reversing centuries of construction in a matter of years. Carved stonework was catalogued and removed. Roof timbers were salvaged. Lead was stripped from the remaining surfaces. The final dramatic act came in February 1927. The remaining structural walls, too unstable to dismantle safely by hand, were brought down by controlled explosion. Contemporary photographs show the moment of detonation. Columns that had stood for 2 centuries crumbling in clouds of dust, porticos designed to impress collapsing into rubble. Within hours, Hamilton Palace was gone. Only the mausoleum remained, too massive and too well constructed to demolish economically. It stands today as the sole visible remnant of what was once Britain's greatest private palace. The site was cleared and grassed over. For decades, it served various municipal purposes, playing fields, parking, storage. The town of Hamilton expanded around and over the palace's former footprint. New buildings rose where state apartments once received royalty, but the ground remembered. Subsidence continued long after the palace's demolition. The mines beneath the estate operated until the 1940s, when the coal seams were finally exhausted. Even after closure, the tunnels continued settling, compressing, finding new equilibrium after centuries of extraction. Archaeological investigations in recent decades have revealed traces of the palace beneath the modern surface. Foundation walls appear as crop marks in dry summers. Fragments of decorated plaster emerge during construction excavations. The outline of the great building persists, ghost-like, beneath the ordinary landscape of a Scottish town. The Hamilton family, stripped of their ancestral seat, adapted as aristocratic families do. The 13th Duke relocated to Dungavel House, a modest hunting lodge on the estate's fringes. Subsequent dukes dispersed across properties in Scotland and England, never again commanding a residence approaching Hamilton Palace's scale. The title continues today, held by the 16th Duke. But the vast lands, the coal revenues, and the palace itself have all passed into memory. What remains is a mausoleum, a collection of scattered fragments, and the question that historians still debate: could Hamilton Palace have been saved? The answer, almost certainly, is no. The forces that destroyed it were set in motion long before anyone recognized the danger. The coal that built the palace was always destined to destroy it. Chapter 7. Diaspora of Treasures. The destruction of Hamilton Palace scattered its contents across 3 continents. Tracking the diaspora of the Hamilton collection reveals a network of sales, gifts, and transfers that continues to shape museum collections today. The Great Christie's Sale of 1882 remains the primary dispersal event. 17 days of auction, 2,213 lots, and total receipts exceeding $400,000 transformed the private Hamilton collection into a widely distributed public resource, but this distribution followed patterns reflecting late Victorian wealth and taste. American industrialists proved particularly aggressive buyers. The decades following the Civil War had created fortunes seeking cultural legitimacy through European art acquisition. Hamilton Palace's sale coincided precisely with this golden age of American collecting. William Henry Vanderbilt purchased extensively from the Hamilton sale, acquiring furniture and decorative arts that would eventually pass to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. J.P. Morgan, though not personally present, bid through agents on paintings that interested him. William Randolph Hearst acquired armorial pieces that would later furnish his California castle at San Simeon. The paintings dispersed most widely. Rubens' Daniel in the Lion's Den, one of the masterpieces of the Hamilton collection, was purchased by a British dealer who subsequently sold it to an American collector. It now hangs in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Titian's Venus Anadyomene followed a similar transatlantic journey, eventually reaching the National Gallery of Scotland through a circuitous path of sales and bequests. Van Dyck's portraits of Charles I and Henrietta Maria, commissioned by the Stuart King himself and inherited by the Hamiltons through their royal connections, were purchased by the National Gallery in London. They remain among that institution's most significant British holdings. But not all treasures went to museums. The furniture collection, much of it French and of the highest quality, entered private hands and often remained there. Boule cabinets acquired by American collectors passed through successive generations, occasionally emerging at auction, but more often remaining in family ownership. Tracking these pieces requires genealogical research as much as art historical investigation. The Egyptian antiquities posed particular problems. The 10th Duke's collection included items of genuine archaeological significance, but 19th-century provenance documentation was often inadequate. Some pieces reached museum collections with clear Hamilton Palace provenance. Others disappeared into private hands, their origins obscured by successive sales. The 10th Duke's personal sarcophagus, that extraordinary porphyry vessel commissioned from Egyptian quarries, remained with the family longer than most treasures. It held the Duke's embalmed body in the mausoleum until subsidence threatened even that structure. When the body was relocated to a local cemetery, the sarcophagus proved too heavy and too valuable to move with it. The sarcophagus was eventually sold, passing through several owners before being acquired by the British Museum. It remains on display today, though visitors rarely connect this ancient-looking object with the Scottish palace that commissioned it. Architectural fragments followed perhaps the most complex dispersal patterns. The salvage companies that purchased the palace itself sold materials to clients across Britain and beyond. The grand staircase, reinstalled in a Glasgow hotel, survived until that building's own demolition decades later. Chimney pieces appear in English country houses whose owners sought authentic Georgian fittings at reduced prices. Some Hamilton Palace elements remain unlocated. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate ceiling paintings that do not appear in any known collection. Carved stonework catalogued during demolition has never been traced. The bronze doors of the mausoleum, among the finest metalwork in Scotland, were removed during World War II for salvage and never returned. The Hamilton archives themselves dispersed along with the physical collections. Family papers passed to the National Records of Scotland, providing the documentary foundation for subsequent historical research. But private correspondence, account books, and estate records were often sold with the palace's contents, entering collections from which they have only partially emerged. Modern researchers face significant challenges reconstructing the Hamilton collection's original scope. Auction catalogs from 1882 provide lot descriptions but rarely illustrations. Insurance inventories survive incompletely. Family correspondence references acquisitions without always specifying what was purchased. The collection's dispersal also raises questions about cultural heritage and ownership that resonate today. Should treasures accumulated through mining wealth extracted from bound laborers be considered part of Scottish national heritage? Do American museums holding Hamilton pieces have obligations to acknowledge their complex provenance? What responsibilities attach to objects whose purchase price derived from human exploitation? These questions admit no easy answers, but they ensure that Hamilton Palace's legacy extends far beyond architecture into ongoing debates about museums, empire, and the ethics of collection. The physical fragments of the palace, scattered across continents, embedded in other buildings, displayed in museum cases, constitute a kind of architectural resurrection. Hamilton Palace no longer exists as a unified structure, but its materials persist, transformed and redistributed, continuing lives that the 10th Duke never imagined. In Glasgow, carved stonework from the palace facade adorns a municipal building. In Philadelphia, a Hamilton Palace chimney piece warms a corporate boardroom. In Tokyo, a Boule cabinet from the 1882 sale occupies a collector's climate-controlled vault. The palace that was too grand to save has become, paradoxically, too significant to disappear entirely. Its destruction scattered seeds that continue germinating in unexpected locations and contexts. Chapter 8. Uncovering Hidden Histories. For decades following the palace's demolition, Hamilton history meant aristocratic history. The dukes and their ambitions dominated scholarly attention. The palace itself was mourned as an architectural loss, its destruction attributed to unfortunate geology and changing times. But recent decades have witnessed a fundamental reorientation. Historians, archaeologists, and community researchers have begun recovering the stories that traditional narratives excluded. The workers, servants, and local residents whose lives intersected with Hamilton Palace are finally receiving scholarly attention. This recovery work began with the mining communities. Local historians in South Lanarkshire, often descendants of mining families themselves, started assembling evidence that formal archives had neglected. Parish records revealed mortality patterns that documented the human cost of coal extraction. Census returns showed the cramped housing conditions that estate owners considered adequate for their workers. Oral histories, collected before the last generation of mining families passed, preserved memories that written records never captured. One particularly significant discovery emerged from estate account books that had passed into private hands after the 1919 sale. These ledgers, purchased by a local collector and later donated to the regional archives, documented payment practices that reveal the economic reality of estate employment. The accounts show that mining families were often paid in scrip, tokens redeemable only at company stores operated by the estate. This system, technically illegal after 1831, but widely practiced, ensured that wages returned immediately to Hamilton coffers. Workers remained perpetually indebted, their apparent earnings an illusion maintained through accounting fiction. The same ledgers record payments to widows and orphans of workers killed in mining accidents. These compassionate payments were discretionary rather than obligatory, and the amounts varied enormously depending on the estate agent's assessment of the family's deservingness. A widow with young children might receive £5. A widow whose husband had been known to drink might receive nothing. Archaeological investigation has supplemented archival research. Survey work on the palace site in the 1990s revealed foundation traces that documented the building's full extent. But more significant discoveries emerged from sites associated with the working population. Excavation of a former mining settlement on the estate uncovered material culture that illuminates daily life in ways that documents cannot. Ceramic fragments show that mining families purchased cheap, locally produced pottery rather than the imported wares available to wealthier households. Glass bottles reveal the prominence of patent medicines, remedies for conditions that proper medical care might have prevented. Children's toys, made from scrap materials, speak to a childhood that combined play with adult responsibilities. One particularly poignant find was a collection of religious medals discovered in the foundation of a demolished cottage. These Catholic devotional objects suggest that mining families maintained private faith practices despite pressure to conform to Presbyterian norms. The medals date from the mid-19th century, a period when Catholic identity could mean social exclusion even in relatively tolerant Scotland. Research into the domestic servant population has followed different methodologies. Census returns provide basic demographic data: names, ages, places of birth. But reconstructing individual servant careers requires cross-referencing multiple sources, tracking individuals as they appear in successive records. This painstaking work has revealed patterns invisible in single-source analysis. Servants at Hamilton Palace tended to come from specific geographic areas, communities where estate connections provided referral networks. They often worked at multiple great houses during their careers, moving through an aristocratic employment circuit that spanned Scotland and northern England. And they frequently retired to modest circumstances, their years of service conferring social status but limited financial security. One researcher has reconstructed the complete career of Janet Morrison, who worked at Hamilton Palace from 1865 to 1891. Morrison entered service at 16 as an under-housemaid, the lowest rank in the female servant hierarchy. Over 26 years, she rose to become head housemaid, supervising a staff of 8. Her wages increased from $12 to $28 annually, modest growth that reflected both her advancing position and the household's declining fortunes. Morrison's story emerges from fragments, census entries, a single surviving letter, references in estate accounts. But these fragments accumulate into a recognizable life. A woman who found purpose and identity in service while remaining permanently subordinate to those she served. The recovery of these hidden histories transforms understanding of Hamilton Palace itself. The building was never simply an aristocratic residence. It was the visible peak of a vast economic and social system that encompassed thousands of lives. The grandeur that visitors admired was produced by labor that remained deliberately invisible. This perspective does not diminish the palace's architectural significance. The building genuinely represented extraordinary achievement in design and craftsmanship, but it contextualizes that achievement within systems of exploitation and inequality that the original builders took for granted. Modern visitors to the mausoleum, the only substantial remnant of the Hamilton complex, increasingly encounter interpretation that acknowledges this fuller history. Signage now references the mining communities whose labor-funded construction. Educational programs discuss the servant population alongside the ducal family. The site has become not merely a memorial to lost grandeur, but a teaching tool for understanding Victorian class relations. This interpretive shift reflects broader changes in heritage practice. Across Britain and beyond, historic sites are grappling with histories of exploitation that earlier generations preferred to ignore. Hamilton Palace's story, of wealth derived from extraction, of grandeur built on invisible labor, of collapse caused by the very processes that created prosperity, resonates with contemporary concerns about sustainability, inequality, and environmental consequence. The hidden histories are hidden no longer. What remains is the work of integration, weaving these recovered stories into a unified narrative that honors complexity while acknowledging responsibility. Chapter 9. What Hamilton Palace Means Today. The site where Hamilton Palace once stood is now a public park. Children play football where state apartments received royalty. Dog walkers traverse paths that overlay vanished corridors. Only the mausoleum remains, its bronze doors sealed, its interior rarely accessible to visitors. This transformation from private magnificence to public amenity encapsulates the broader arc of British social history. The aristocratic world that created Hamilton Palace has not simply declined, it has been democratized, its exclusive spaces converted to common use, its treasures distributed to public institutions. But what lessons does this particular conversion offer? The most obvious concerns the relationship between extraction and construction. Hamilton Palace rose on coal profits and fell when coal extraction undermined its foundations. This irony, the same process both enabling and destroying, carries resonance for contemporary debates about environmental sustainability. The Hamilton Dukes extracted wealth from the earth without considering long-term consequences. They built magnificently in the present while creating conditions that would devastate the future. When the ground literally gave way beneath their creation, they had no response but abandonment. Modern observers may recognize parallels with contemporary extraction industries. The carbon that warmed Hamilton Palace now warms the planet. The economic model that enriched one family while impoverishing many has scaled to global dimensions. The intergenerational transfer of costs, present benefits, future consequences, continues in forms the 10th Duke would have found familiar. Hamilton Palace also illuminates the fragility of seemingly permanent structures. The building was designed to last forever. Its stone was meant to defy centuries. Its collections were assembled with dynastic permanence in mind. Yet within 3 generations of its completion, the entire complex had vanished. This fragility was not primarily architectural. The building materials remained sound. The craftsmanship was exemplary. What failed was the economic and social system that supported the structure. When coal revenues declined, when death duties extracted wealth, when maintenance costs exceeded income, the palace became unsustainable regardless of its physical condition. Contemporary parallels suggest themselves. How many modern structures depend on economic conditions that may prove temporary? How many institutions assume permanence that changing circumstances may deny? Hamilton Palace reminds us that buildings, like the societies that create them, are embedded in historical processes that can shift with devastating speed. The treatment of labor at Hamilton Palace raises questions that remain urgent today. The miners who funded construction had no stake in what they created. The servants who maintained operations had no ownership of their work product. The wealth that built magnificence was extracted from those who would never share it. This model of labor, alienated, exploited, invisible, persists in modified forms. Contemporary supply chains obscure the workers who produce the goods that wealthy consumers enjoy. Service workers in hospitality and domestic employment remain largely invisible to those they serve. The fundamental structure of Hamilton Palace, magnificent surfaces supported by hidden labor, finds echoes in contemporary economic arrangements. Recognizing these continuities does not require condemning the Hamiltons as uniquely villainous. They operated within systems they did not create and held assumptions that their society considered natural. But acknowledging the moral complexity of their achievement allows more honest engagement with both past and present. The dispersal of Hamilton Palace's collections raises questions about cultural heritage that contemporary institutions continue to debate. Should treasures assembled through exploitation be returned to their places of origin? Do universal museums serve the common good, or do they perpetuate historical inequalities? What obligations attach to ownership of objects with troubling histories? These questions admit no simple answers, but Hamilton Palace's story provides useful perspective. The collection was assembled through wealth derived from coal extraction and labor exploitation. It was sold to address debts accumulated through aristocratic extravagance. It now resides in institutions across 3 continents, accessible to publics that the original collectors never imagined. This trajectory, from private accumulation to public distribution, might be seen as a kind of rough justice. The treasures that Hamilton wealth sequestered now belong, in some sense, to everyone. The 10th Duke's obsessive collecting has become, inadvertently, a gift to museum visitors worldwide. But this interpretation risks obscuring the violence embedded in the collection's origins. The paintings, the furniture, the Egyptian antiquities, all were purchased with wealth that cost human lives to accumulate. Their beauty is real. So is the suffering that made their purchase possible. Perhaps the most important lesson Hamilton Palace offers concerns memory itself. For decades after demolition, the palace was remembered primarily through aristocratic nostalgia. The magnificent building, the famous collections, the ducal family, these dominated historical attention while workers, servants, and local communities remained invisible. The recovery of hidden histories over recent decades has challenged this selective memory. Researchers have documented the mining communities, the servant hierarchies, the economic systems that made magnificence possible. The story has become more complex, more troubling, and ultimately more truthful. This process of historical recovery is never complete. New sources emerge. New perspectives illuminate previously obscured dimensions. The meaning of Hamilton Palace continues evolving as successive generations bring their own questions to its history. What remains constant is the site itself. the grass-covered ground where a palace once stood, the mausoleum that survived when everything else fell, the absence that speaks louder than presence ever could. Chapter 10. Remembering what was lost. Stand today on the grounds of Hamilton's public park, and you see nothing that suggests former grandeur. The grass is municipal, the trees are recent plantings. Only the mausoleum hints at what once existed here, and even that structure, sealed and deteriorating, offers limited testimony. But absence is itself a presence. The greatest house in Britain once stood on this spot. Royalty walked these grounds. Treasures rivaling any museum collection filled these rooms. And then, within a single generation, all of it vanished. Hamilton Palace teaches us that nothing built by human hands is permanent. Not stone walls, however thick. Not art collections, however magnificent. Not family dynasties, however ancient. The forces of geology, economics, and social change will have their way eventually. But the palace also teaches that the past never entirely disappears. Its materials scattered across continents, embedding fragments of Hamilton in structures the builders never imagined. Its treasures fill museums that visitors explore today. Its archives preserve documents that historians continue mining for insight. And its stories of builders and servants, of miners and aristocrats, of ambition and exploitation, continue resonating with contemporary concerns. We began this journey with a question. How does the greatest house in Britain become a car park? The answer involves geology and economics, hubris and fate, coal seams and death duties. But it also involves choices, decisions made by generations of Hamiltons who prioritized display over sustainability, magnificence over maintenance, present glory over future security. Those choices carry lessons for our own time. The extraction economies that built Hamilton Palace continue in modified forms. The inequality that separated ducal splendor from mining poverty persists in new configurations. The temptation to build monuments to ourselves without counting long-term costs remains as powerful as ever. Hamilton Palace no longer stands, but its story continues, speaking across centuries to anyone willing to listen. The ground remembers what we build upon it, and eventually, the ground collects its debts. If you found value in exploring this forgotten chapter of British history, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Next week, we examine another lost mansion, one that still stands but has been transformed beyond recognition. Until then, keep looking beneath the surface of the places around you. Every landscape holds stories waiting to be uncovered.